And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Up first is the ice edge from last Saturday, and you can see had really thinned out here along the southwest coast into Bristol Bay. It was quite a ways up, a little bit here down towards St. Matthew Island, but taking a look at today, 6 days later, you can see it's made a pretty good advance and jog off to the south and southwest here, especially a big buildup here in Bristol Bay and southward, and the thinner ice is almost halfway between St. Paul and Nunivak Islands, and back to the north also a big increase there. And let me back that up once again. You can see also from Cook Inlet here, especially over the western areas all the way down into Kamishak Bay, seeing some ice increases. And that'll continue here, at least over the Bering Sea for the next several days. And for the forecast tonight, low pressure coming up toward the eastern North Gulf Coast, wet and windy for the Panhandle with snow, Haines to Skagway, areas of snow here over the southeast interior, and also diminishing winds for the Bering Sea here, coming down from what they were earlier, but no big storms coming in. This low pressure area tracking southeastward. That'll bring some wind and snow into the Pribilofs tomorrow afternoon and evening, and that'll track off to the southeast here, crossing the eastern Aleutians late Saturday night and early Sunday for snow and some wind there, snow showers up to the Alaska Peninsula, back to Adak and Atka, but pretty light winds out here over the Bering Sea, while the northeast interior staying cold, milder though, here over the eastern interior due to the clouds and snow, and then wet and windy for the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast for the Panhandle on the south coast tomorrow, south winds 25 knots, south to southeast 25 to 30 knot winds for the central coast, and the north coast south to southeast 20 to 30 knots. Lynn Canal, southeast winds 25 knots, gusting to 40 knots, southeast 20 gusts 35 for Stevens Passage, and 25 to 35 knot southeast winds for Clarence Strait. And for Sunday, southeast winds 30 knots, Clarence Strait 20 knots for Stevens Passage, and 15 knots for Lynn Canal. South coast, south at 30 knots, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots on the central coast, and the north coast looking at southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, northwest winds about 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Variable 15-knot winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, but northwest at 30 knots here for the western coast. And good gales continue. Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands out of the northwest at 40 knots. Cook Inlet, variable winds north of the Forelands. Light variable winds there, and about north of 20 for the southern areas. And then for the day on Sunday, northern Cook Inlet, northeast winds at 10 knots. Small craft advisories here. South of the Forelands, north winds 25 knots, 35-knot northwest winds, Kamishak Bay, and about 30 knots for the Barren Islands. And for the North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 15 knots, north at 20 for the western North Gulf Coast, and Prince William Sound, north winds at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, north winds tomorrow, 25 to 35 knots with the gales in Shelikof Strait out of the northwest. And for Bristol Bay, north winds 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, north winds to northeast winds, 25 to 40 knots. And for Sunday, Bristol Bay, north winds at 15 knots, and the Alaska Peninsula here, northeast to northwest winds, 20 to 25 knots. Kodiak Island, north to northwest winds at 25 to 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, pretty simple. Northeast, 40 knots. Gales also for Adak and Atka for northeast winds at 35 knots. And the western Aleutians, small craft advisories for 25 to 35 knot winds out of the northeast. And for Sunday, coming much lighter and more variable out here from Kiska to Shemya, 10 to 15 knots, and even Amchitka Island, north to northwest at 15 knots. Adak and Atka, northwest winds 20 knots. Still looking at some gales for Unalaska Island, northwest 35 to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast, north winds tomorrow 20 to 25 knots here. St. Lawrence Island, north winds at 20 knots, northeast 15 for St. Matthew Island. Small craft advisories for the Pribilofs for northeast winds at 25 knots and northwest of 15 for Norton Sound. And for Sunday, Norton Sound, northwest winds at 10 knots. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, north winds 15 knots and about 20 knots here south of Nunivak Island. 15-knot northerlies in the forecast for St. Matthew Island. Still a little brisk there for the Pribilofs, north winds at 30 knots with 10-foot seas. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, on average, an easterly wind at 15 to 20 knots. Central coast, south at 10 knots. And southwest, 15 knots for the western coast. And the Chukchi Sea, west to northwest winds at 15 knots. And the outlook for Sunday for the Chukchi Sea, northeast to northwest winds, 10 to 15 knots. Northeast at 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. Central coast, north at 10. And north 15 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, except from Kaktovik, Barter Island, demarcation point, they'll be about 20 knots from the west.